Well, hello there, and welcome to Star Wars Aspects of A New Hope. So I'm looking at woodwind voicings mainly, and the various sort of issues surrounding them. So I've done a few already. I've done the main title and sort of, which is basically M1, M1, 2, 3, and 4. So there's a very short desert cue. So I thought we'd do that today because of the similarity between that and the Rite of Spring. So we'll have a look at that. And also all the really interesting bits in Little People as well, which is a fantastic cue and really iconic as well. But I'm going to start off with a really interesting quote, because the reason I'm doing this is sort of in response to, although I didn't read the passage before starting this, but the book has just arrived. It's called The Cambridge Companion to Composition, edited by Toby Young. And it's a fantastic book. It really is. It's packed full of so many things, just mainly ideas really for you to sort of challenge yourself with. And there's a really good chapter called Composing for Orchestra by Roberto Sierra, and right at the very, very end he says something really interesting. He says the late Jacob Druckmann, 1928 to 1996, whom I consider a true master of orchestral writing, once told me that he used to study Mahler's symphonies, reading one instrumental line at a time whilst listening to a recording. Although there are excellent texts on orchestration, I find that the best way to learn is to study in detail the extensive orchestral literature from the early 20th century to the present. And I think that's absolutely so correct. It's really interesting, and also particularly with regards to film music is often rather different from the symphonic orchestral writing, which is why it's really interesting to sort of look into. But I love that idea of just looking at one instrumental line and going all the way through the cue, just to sort of really highlight absolutely everything there is about it. So I'm starting that with the woodwind in general, really, and it means that when you go to these things, my patrons have access to all of this. They can actually go into the folders and files and things, and then draw up all of the various sort of relevant bits. So if we start with the desert, this is how it looks, and really weirdly, oh hello, just sort of suddenly disappeared. Really weirdly, there is an error, I think, in the oboe 2. If you notice, everybody's playing tones. And later on, everybody's playing tones. Like that. Everybody's playing tones. The only person who's not playing a tone, the very, very beginning, is this. And I think that's an error. I think it should be an F flat. So that we go like that, because otherwise it doesn't make sense to sort of everything else is planed later on. So if everything else is played later on, surely that means that the everything should be planed here as well. But of course, on the recording, the oboe 2 is actually quite out of tune. So if you do a sort of transcribe function and slow it down and everything, it's extremely difficult to kind of really highlight whether that's actually a rather flat F or a rather sharp F flat. Either way, it should probably have been an F flat, because then in the actual reduction itself, and I've done all of this already, this chord is called 6Z19B in terms of a pitch class set, and in terms of what the chords actually are, they are two chords which are a minor second apart. So two minor chords a minor second apart. So if we look closely, we've got E flat minor, and we've also got D minor as well at the same time, like that. So that is what it probably should be. Of course, and then that sonority should really be the same here. So instead of a D flat major chord like that, which sounds rather peculiar, it should be a D flat minor chord with a C minor chord. Otherwise, it doesn't really make sense. That's much more gnarly than what we have. Of course, when you listen to it, it is not really noticeable because of the fact of the second oboe being rather out of tune. So it doesn't really, it's a bit strange. But anyway, it means that then that would be 6Z26, which I've never seen before ever in any of John Williams's work. But I've seen 6Z19B again and again and again and again and again. So I think I'm kind of drawing a conclusion there, which is sort of based on as much evidence as I've got access to. But the interesting thing is about what's the placement of all of these instruments. So if we look at it, the oboe 1 is playing the top line. So let's call that voice 1. Oboe 2 is playing the second voice down. And then we've got flutes, which are playing the last voice. So they're below the oboes. So, of course, normally you would have your flutes over the oboes. But in this case, they're actually below. So we've got 2 flutes here because, of course, the third one is about to do a piccolo solo. So it doesn't take part in any of this. And indeed, D flat is below the lowest note on the piccolo anyway because it starts on D. Unless there's some sort of unusual instrument going on. So we've got oboe 1, oboe 2, then the flutes. But, of course, on the different chord, on this chord, that D minor bit of the chord, and let's just highlight that. That's all the clarinets. So interesting that is what is going on. So that we end up with the clarinet 1 note above that flute note, and also the second clarinet 1 note below that flute note. So there's a certain amount of sort of weird interlocking as well. Really interesting. So let's see whether I can kind of play that. Yeah, it's really interesting. I think it does play an F flat, the oboe. But it's actually not mixed that well, so I can't really hear it very clearly. So it's very, very difficult, because if I play all of this, which is the original, that second chord just doesn't sound right when I compare it with this. So I have a feeling those should all be F flat. So I haven't changed them there because I sort of kept it how it was, but I think it should be F flat. And in fact, one useful little experiment is to just to do that and then see how that compares. Yeah, I mean, I think that just sounds authentic to me. Let's compare it with... Yeah, very, very awkward. And there's a bow which seems to have hit a stand, or maybe it's conductor's baton on the recording, which I think is interesting as well. Anyway, the main point, the thrust of what I was getting at is the fact that we've got a really unusual voicing. So oboe 1, oboe 2, then both flutes, then the clarinet, which is actually above that flute, then, but they're all playing the same chord. So, you know, I'm wondering if he had 3 oboes, would he have used the third oboe as that? And I think he probably would have done. That would sort of, you know, be in its spirit, probably. But anyway, a sort of an interesting point. And the other thing about it is that, of course, lots of people sort of go, well, it sounds just like The Rite of Spring, Part 2, The Sacrifice. So there are definite similarities. I mean, you know, they're both quavers. They're both slow. And they both start on a similar chord, but not quite. So whereas this is E flat minor and D minor, in the original of The Rite of Spring, there is an E flat minor sonority, but we've also got just the A added. So we've got that E flat minor with a sharp 4 type sound or sonority. But then it goes somewhere completely different and goes into a C sharp minor add 4. Like that. So it's rather different on the piano. Like that. Of course, I'm only showing the upper harmony of this because there's even more sort of other stuff going on as well. So if we compare it on... I thought I had a sort of YouTube thing of it here, so I do, which is rather good. So I think it's all lined up. Just the beginning of this. So there are some similarities because of, consordini trumpets and the fact that it's slow. But aside from that, that's basically... that's where it ends, really, because we've, basically Williams has extended Stravinsky's sonority, so it's not just E flat minor with a sharp 4. In fact, it's E flat minor and D minor at the end, and then he planes all of them as well, so that it doesn't go to a new chord in the second quaver. And of course, there are definite similarities in terms of the general atmosphere, the vibe, I suppose. Although actually the desert here is a lot more sparse with what we've got. So, whereas Stravinsky's sort of filled with various bits and sort of tones and things like that, and also a sustained note, Williams is not. Yeah. And sort of really interesting, sort of very strange sort of doublings of things as well, which is rather interesting. And then of course we get the muted trumpets, which do sound a little bit reminiscent of Stravinsky as well. Let's just go back into it. But of course it's a different sonority because of the fact we've got all of these really, really low horns. In fact, you can sort of see this one here, which goes down to a written, what is that, A, so sounding D as well, which is interesting. So you've got sort of D, G, A, and then D at the end as well. So you've got sort of rather interesting sort of sonority at that point as well. So it is somewhat different, I have to say. Anyway, the main thrust was that woodwind voicing. But also, I think it's important to talk about, the sonority of the chord as well, this sort of 6Z19B. And there is a very, very good article, if anybody is interested, which is this one by Daniel Chua, called Writing with Stravinsky, a Particular Analysis of the Rite of Spring, which is in Music Analysis, published in July 2008. So it's quite a while ago now. But basically, the sort of thrust of it is that he doesn't really agree with any analysis of what the augur's chord was, and goes through all the various analyses, which include Alan Fort's one of this augur's chord, but makes a really interesting sort of discovery, which is that Stravinsky himself, in a CBS interview, didn't play the chord in the order of notes that you find it, and that kind of gives you a little bit of a clue as to how he saw that chord itself, not as a bitonal chord, but as a sonority in itself. And so there's a whole sort of bunch of very, very sort of technical information about sort of octatonicism and whether it's wholly octatonic or not quite octatonic, that sort of thing. And in fact, actually, the chord that Williams comes up with, this one, is actually derived from a Hungarian minor scale, not even an octatonic scale at all. And we know that he uses a Hungarian minor scale quite a lot, mostly actually in Empire, not in A New Hope. But anyway, there we go. That's some little things about the desert. Just a quick word though about Stravinsky, because we can't ignore that. You know, we've got the sustained A, which is played by oboe 1 and oboe 2, but then the order of voices is that we then got clarinets above that and sort of below. So that's clarinet 1, that's clarinet 2, then we've got flute 1, then we've got flute 2, flute 3, and then clarinet in E flat, so a very high piccolo clarinet, the lowest sounding note. So again, it's Stravinsky's reversal of, you know, sort of the typical registers of what we associate with those instruments. So, you know, that bassoon, very, very high bassoon beginning, for example, is where it is. So you can see just by looking at the clarinet piccolo in E flat, look how low it is on the stave. So it goes down to 3 ledger lines as well. And it seems to still blend in rather well with everything. Let's have another listen to it. And it does sound rather octatonic as well. But we got those strings blended in, so very different in terms of, you know, what Williams does with the desert. The sort of that incredible sort of deep roll. So you've got sort of 2 timpanis, big bass drum going on at the same time, and then this sort of really interesting sonority of 2 tubas, 3 trombones. I wonder whether that 2 tubas was something that Williams sort of took up a little bit of, because of course here we've got sort of, you know, things like 8 horns and 4 bassoons and you know, contrabassoon, all of this sort of 2 bass clarinets, 2 normal clarinets in B flat, piccolo clarinet, cor anglais, 4 oboes, alto flute, normal flute, piccolo, all of this sort of thing. It's such a massive, huge orchestra. It must have been incredibly expensive to put on at the time. Anyway, so we're going to move on to Little People. I wanted to do this in the same video, really, thinking that actually, you know, although there's more content in Little People, there's not much more to say about what's happening. So some of the woodwind voices that we got just in bar 1, we've got an interesting thing where he's got cor anglais and bassoons, and they're playing that sharp 4 chord, which is interesting because that was a sort of chord a little bit like what happens there. So here we've got E minor. Notice that it's in 2nd inversion, so in other words, with the 5th from the root in the bass. So, and then we've got the B flat played by the cor anglais, and then it's just planed all the way up chromatically like that. So it's an interesting sort of sonority again of, you know, similar double reeds with the appropriate registers. So that's in Little People. I think for some reason I've got 2 of those up and running, so let's close one of them down. Otherwise we're going to get rather confused, so I'm not going to bother doing that one. So yes, in Little People, right at the very beginning, it's this little bit here, which appears again. Like that. Little cheeky sort of Jawa idea. Those flutes are just in thirds. And then it goes up a little bit like that, and essentially it's exactly the same. There's a really interesting another bit in this, which I've done before actually, with just clarinets like that, which is wonderful. It's so sort of atonal but not quite atonal, sort of really weird, but just a lovely sort of sonority, bar 1. and just stacked. So here we've then got some more stacking, but you'll also see that there's more sort of mixed timbres. So the piccolo is all the way up at the top. This is bar 11 in Little People. So let's just do that. Here we go. Yeah, and it's just this little bit here. So the only sort of real difference is that we've got a little glockenspiel, which is just playing the first notes of each of those sets of semiquavers. So basically quaver there, and there. So that's the only sort of mixed sound that we've got. Otherwise, that's it. And then there's a little harp gliss right at the end. With some wonderful wrong note bass that comes in as well. So in this one, we've got flute 1 and oboe 1. So that's, yeah, absolutely, you would agree with that in terms of what you would put there. But then you've got flute 2 and cor anglais. And then again, he always keeps his clarinets rather low and much lower than you might think with oboes and even cor anglais. So actually the cor anglais is higher than both of those clarinets. And then bass clarinet on the lowest sounding bit. So again, quite an interesting sort of mixed timbre. So here, piccolo, flute and oboe, so flobo, let's call it, flute and cor anglais, flonglais, and then clarinet 1 and clarinet 2 on the same pitch, and B flat clarinet there as well. So in terms of the amount of notes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and that's the recommended outcome. So the single instruments are right at the very top and right at the very bottom, and all of the blends are in the middle. But it's still interesting that the cor anglais is above the clarinets. A little bit further on in bar 17, we have this little section, which is this bit here, this sort of converging progression. Like that, which is wonderful, absolutely superb. And I've done a whole video about that, all of that, and what the notes are and everything else. You know, usually it's quite nice to have a look at that sort of second piano just to sort of confirm what on earth is actually going on. So basically just wrong note bass all over the place. Which seems to work chromatically, and minor chords planed up with that going on. So that's a sort of +1. In other words, the E, just one note away, and then it converges with one repeated note. But in this one, we've just got flute 1, flute 2, clarinet 1 and clarinet 2 just stacked. So no oboes in that whole thing. And I haven't shown the whole piccolo bit because that just sort of confuses things, basically. But essentially, it's just an octave above that first flute. Does something slightly different, obviously, because this is in C. That's what the bass clarinet should look like. But then, obviously, it's... Whoops, put the wrong thing in there. That's really annoying. There we go. So I should probably just put a bass note there when it's back in, so we can see what's going on. So yeah, sort of interesting doublings as well. And I will talk about, you know, how woodwinds blend in with everything else and how brass blends in with everything else, but that's for another time. Then we got some stacking. In this case, with oboe preferred as the single note at the top, then 2 clarinets beneath it. But that actually swaps a bit later on when it's slightly lower in register. So here we've got, you know, that E flat up there, so E flat 5, and here we've got F sharp 4, so in the 4th octave at that point. So you know, could it be that it's because of the where it is? So that's sort of, you know, middle of the stave. It's oboe, 2 clarinets. Sort of this little bit with 2 other bits, it's actually 2 oboes and then clarinet right at the end. And of course, that would be very honky if that was an oboe too. So it's much better to put it on the clarinet, and obviously it also means they don't have to go too much over the break because it's actually quite slow in terms of all of those fingers being down on the clarinet or up. And then here another blend, but this time of only 3 instruments, where we've got flutes 1, 2 and 3 and clarinet 1. Then we've got oboe 1 and clarinet 2, and then on the middle note, and then cor anglais there as well. So let's just have a quick look at that. So 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. Yeah, so it's this bit here, and I'll just play the woodwinds that we're concerned about. Like that. So that's what's going on at that point. And there's a slight change, so this does sort of carry on. So at the time we got flutes, all flutes and clarinet, oboe 1 and clarinet 2, then cor anglais. Then we've got some other things joining. So in this case, the bass clarinet is sort of with the bassoons. So bass clarinet, bassoon 1 and 2 together, and then bassoon 3. So again, keeping the solo instruments on the outside of the triad or the outside of the chord, and then keeping blends on the inside of the chord. Could that be a thing? Could be. Here, slightly different, but it's clarinet 2, which is the lowest sounding one, cor anglais blended with clarinet 1, oboe 1, and then flutes 1, 2 and 3 on the top. Then the oboe 1 and clarinet 1 actually merge together because it's a different chord, and then the cor anglais, which was there, instead of going up to the A, goes down for an extra A and actually swaps. So sort of very, very technical stuff going on. So you can see here where that cor anglais, if we just try and follow the line, it's on its own, but then it sort of joins clarinet 1 at that point, and then does the A a little bit lower. Like that. And also it's interesting that sort of, he really wants that sort of weird blended dyad sound. Like that. And then with the rest of the wind. And it gets a real clarity above it, because basically all the mush, all the sort of harmonic mush is in the brass. Like that, playing the actual sort of extended harmony at that point as well. And again, all of those chords are enumerated for everyone on the various sort of bits of reduction that I've done for it, which you can find elsewhere. So a nice sort of interesting sort of technical stuff going on here. And then we've got the stacking, which I've already mentioned. And then here we've got stacking oboe 1 and oboe 2, then clarinet 1 and clarinet 2. So another stacking. This one, a contrasted stacking. So this is bar 61. So if I go back here and go 61, that should take us to the place that we need to go. And at this point, we've got that line here, which is all in triads. So flute 1, flute 2, and then the lowest one is clarinet 1. And it continues that way. Like that. And then that's contrasted with this thing, which is then oboe, cor anglais. By the way, there's only two players, so that's because the cor anglais sometimes goes over to the oboe too. So oboe 1, cor anglais, and then clarinet 2. Like that. So just the woodwind together. This is how it sounds. Nothing else is playing. Like that. Before it sort of goes back into the resonance of the previous. So some other contrasted stacking at that point. So I thought just a little short one for you all at this point was quite a nice sort of relief from everything else. And of course we will go back and then do what are the blends, what blends with it. And actually, interestingly enough, not much. And I am focusing on harmony rather than melody writing. But for example, there's a lot of differentiation in orchestration with Williams. So for example, that idea is not replicated anywhere else. Here we've got little bits of flute, which would usually be plucked with harp. Guess what? It is. Like that as well. It's sort of quite a dry sound. It sounds almost like when you've got that can sound quite like a steel drum, which is rather interesting, that sort of sonority. But, we'll do that another time. So I hope you've enjoyed that, and I would see you very soon, basically. Bye for now.